My name is Jason.
And my name is David.
And this is Discern Realities, a Dungeon World podcast. So we are here with episode 8 of Dungeon World Basics, and the topic for today is fronts, GM fronts, campaign fronts, adventure fronts, and all the associated topics with that. Starting next week, we are going to begin miscellaneous topics, which is probably going to be about 2 episodes worth of stuff. And then we are done with the basics series. So taking a look at fronts, you know, your notes here, David, at the outset pose a question. What are campaign fronts? What are adventure fronts? What are dangers? We're going to answer all those questions. I want to just say at the top, though, that I frequently encounter on social media people, GMs, brand new to Dungeon World, who are, for lack of a better way of putting it, they're paralyzed by the idea of fronts, okay? They think, or at least it's suggested in their comments and their questions, they think that if they do fronts wrong, they're doing Dungeon World wrong, and that the game is going to break if they don't grok and indeed successfully execute fronts. And I'm here to tell you, listeners, especially if you are a beginning Dungeon World GM, that is not true. You can discard fronts entirely and do your own thing, and you're still playing Dungeon World. You're still going to be great. So part of what we're doing here today, David, I think, is we are demystifying fronts.
I completely agree. The entire section of the book that has to deal with campaign fronts, adventure fronts, and dangers can be a little bit confusing. And if you are afraid that if you don't play somehow rules as written, that you're going to mess it up, that's just not the case. This is all about the book trying to help you as a GM prepare for your sessions. It's not supposed to be an inhibiting thing.
Yeah, and importantly, fronts are entirely GM facing, right? Like, your players can't see your fronts, okay? They don't know what you've written there. And so, you know, maybe you don't perfectly follow your fronts. Maybe a danger doesn't behave the way you thought they were going to originally. Maybe you forget a grim portent or something here or there. It doesn't matter. As long as your players are having a good time and it's all kind of making sense, it's okay. Like you can't do it wrong. I think the only way you can kind of quote do fronts wrong is if you try to subvert the basic spirit of them. And the basic spirit of fronts is that you are creating a much looser framework, partially inspired by feedback you're getting from the conversation at the table. You're creating a looser framework, or a loose framework for an adventure or for a campaign with a lot of space and room to make adjustments and to kind of adapt as needed, right? I think what's subverting that, and this is the only way you can kind of do them wrong, is if you insist on turning it into a railroad. Like if you just say, this is the beginning, this is the end, you ignore playing to find out what happens, you ignore playing to find out the answers to stakes questions, and you just kind of railroad the players like we're kind of used to in Dungeons and Dragons, or at least traditionally anyway. That is how you do fronts wrong. Okay, so importantly, I think as long as you're playing in the spirit of what fronts want you to be doing, you can't really get it wrong.
It's also helpful to understand fronts if you're going to be looking at supplements made specifically for Dungeon World, because they will oftentimes have preformed fronts, so you need to know what they mean when they say that. So it's helpful to, if nothing else, understand when other people use the terminology.
Okay, so give us just the sort of like bird's eye big picture here. Like, what are fronts about? What's the deal?
So it's all about prep. That's what it's all about. From the book, it says, fronts are designed to help you organize your thoughts on what opposes the players. They're here to contain your notes, ideas, and plans for these opposing forces. When you're in a bind, your fronts are where you're going to turn and say, oh, so that's what I should do. Consider them as an organizational tool, as inspiration for present or future mayhem.
And that is what it is. I'll tell you in practice, that's what it is. They're just notes. I mean, fronts are just notes. It's a fancy way of saying notes. It's derived from Apocalypse World, and fronts in Apocalypse World are just notes. It's a way of organizing your sessions. It's a way of accounting for what happened in previous sessions. It's a way of proposing, or at least in your mind, anticipating what might happen if players make certain types of decisions. GMs have been doing this since time immemorial. Okay. There's nothing special about this. Having said that, I think that the front way of doing it, the way Apocalypse World would have you do it, and of course, as follows, Dungeon World would have you do it, I think it's an extremely effective way of organizing your notes, right? And until you get the hang of running Apocalypse World based games, you should do your best to try to follow it. But at the end of the day, you might decide, I no longer want to be constrained to this particular way of organizing my notes. And indeed, I personally have not done fronts as written in the book for years. So this is going to be kind of a weird topic for me, but I definitely still like organize my games and run my games in that spirit. So yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. I like that it's an organizational tool. So we're dealing with two different levels, right? Just kind of continuing to define fronts. Campaign fronts, adventure fronts. This is another thing that I see people get hung up on sometimes, but it's really kind of straightforward if you think about it in terms of sessions, right? So if you're playing a one-shot, you might not even need a front, actually, but maybe an adventure front for like a one-shot, two-shot, maybe even up to 4 or 5 sessions. Maybe you have just an adventure front that kind of governs kind of what's going on. You use it to keep all your notes. If you're playing a much longer-term game, then that's when you might use a campaign front, right? Campaign fronts typically link adventure fronts together, or adventure fronts kind of feed back into campaign fronts. And so that's the main difference. In terms of their various elements, they both work the same. It's just different scope.
So adventure fronts are, the way I think about it is, adventure fronts is what's happening today. This is your adventure front. What's happening session 2, session 3, session 4, that's maybe a campaign front, maybe 2 campaign fronts if you're really ambitious. But adventure fronts are like what's happening here right now. And then your campaign front is what's happening elsewhere in the world. And how do your adventure fronts feed into your campaign front? So it's just a hierarchy of organization.
Now, within fronts, we have dangers, right? Dangers are essentially what fronts are comprised of, right? An adventure front is usually comprised of 2, 3, 4 dangers. Kind of depends on the scope of what you're doing. So do you want to talk about dangers a little bit?
Yeah, dangers are what populate your adventure fronts. So if your adventure front is what is happening today at this adventure, then your dangers are what's populating that. What monsters or factions or potentially even environmental effects might be a danger for this particular adventure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's worth like keeping in mind like what should count as a danger, right? Like what is a danger in the grand scheme of things? I think the rust monster or troll or whatever that you run into in the corridors of the dungeon, that's probably not a danger, right?
That's likely not a danger.
Yeah, that's just a monster you're fighting, and that's fine.
Yeah. From the book, it says dangers are not every element of your game will warrant a danger. Traps, some roving monsters, and other bits of ephemera may just be there to add context, but aren't important enough to warrant inclusion as a danger.
Absolutely. I mean, like you might have maybe as a result of a GM move, you want to spring a monster on the group, and, maybe it's a roaming monster, some kind of troll or orc or something. And that's just a GM move, right? Having an orc turn the corner and be facing off against the characters, or having a character stumble into a gelatinous cube or a pit trap or something like that. That's just GM moves, right? A danger is something that is, the way I've always defined it is, or at least for the way I've always used dangers, to me, a danger is something that is kind of like at least one step above that maybe has influence throughout the dungeon or throughout the adventure. Maybe it's something that ties to a particular element of the story or like the ongoing campaign. Maybe it's a thematic detail, right? Let's say you're exploring a temple dedicated to an evil frog cult. That's a thing that's been known to happen in my games. You're exploring this like temple dedicated to an evil frog cult. The monsters, like the little like winged frog monsters or the poisonous frog monsters or whatever, those are just like monsters that you encounter. The danger, though, might be the large stone frog idol that is gradually coming to life and is going to attack the party at some point, right? It's bigger, It's usually more dangerous than an individual monster encounter. It is kind of thematically tied, like really closely to what the adventure is about, like exploring this frog temple. It's more like a set piece, really, right? That's how I've always interpreted dangers.
Yeah, I mean, the book lays out like 4 example categories of what dangers might be. Ambitious organizations, planar forces, arcane enemies, hordes, cursed places. Those are bigger than just some monsters.
Excellent. And again, bear in mind that like whether you're dealing with an adventure front or a campaign front, that also affects the scale of your danger, right? You know, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense in your adventure front to have a danger that is let's say, okay, let's choose one of them, planar forces. Let's say planar forces. Let's say there is one of your planar forces is a powerful demon that is controlling various aspects of society from behind the shadows, right? Really powerful demon, controls lots of important people in the setting and has lots of minions and all that kind of stuff, right? If you're doing an adventure front and the adventure front is for, say, a cave system where you are looking for a special weapon to fight the demon with, that little cave system is part of the bigger demon campaign, right? And so it doesn't make as much sense to have that big, powerful demon creature be in this little cave system where you're trying to find the sword. That sword is important for the bigger campaign front, right? Where the big, huge, powerful demon is one of the dangers of the campaign. The adventure front danger might be a lackey of the demon that protects the sword, or maybe some kind of complex puzzle or trap that protects the sword, right?
I think that's a really good example. But by session 4, if everything has gone great in the first 3 sessions, you've got the sword, you're ready to roll, that's when you'd be encountering that campaign front level demon as an adventure front. That's what's happening today.
Yeah, you've kind of taken elements from the adventure fronts. You've kind of the players have essentially are ready to kind of face the campaign front in some sense, right? That's kind of the idea there. And again, just going back to what we kind of said earlier, it's a hierarchical way of organizing your sessions and organizing and keeping your notes and stuff organized and keeping everything in their proper place. Dangers usually come with there's several elements that make up a danger, as I recall. Bear in mind, I have not used them in a while. Grim portents, there's an impending doom, and then there are stakes questions, correct?
Right. So those are all additional elements to fronts and dangers. So we've discussed fronts and dangers. Hope you have understood it up to this point. And now, what about these grim portents, impending dooms, stakes? How do they fit in with all this?
Grim portents are really important. The way I've always looked at grim portents is they're essentially like countdown clocks or doom clocks that are associated with the danger. Again, depending on our scale, whether we're doing campaign or adventure, depending on the sort of scope of the danger, all that kind of stuff, these countdowns might be much more immediate and granular, or they might be a little bit more drawn out for a bigger danger, right? That's how I look at grim portents. And I'll give some examples in a minute, but what do you think about grim portents?
I tend to agree. I don't think they always have to be a countdown clock. They can be a single occurrence, but usually it's a snowballing thing of what the danger is up to, and it mounts as more and more of them are ticked off in a clock-like manner. But they can just be single occurrences or isolated occurrences of bad things that the danger is getting up to that do not escalate necessarily, but they are bad individually. And then they feed into your impending doom. If all your grim portents go away, then the impending doom occurs. And the impending doom is what happens, if all of the bad things that danger wants to get up to, they accomplish.
Yeah, what comes to pass, basically, if the danger gets its way. I want to go back to grim portents for a minute, because I do think it's important to kind of break down or at least acknowledge scope and scale, right? So back to my previous example of this all-powerful demon that is that is kind of puppet mastering the kingdom or whatever. When you're in that cave looking for the weapon that you can use to face off, the demon with, you're trying to find this weapon. That's your adventure front, the cave, right? The cave where the weapon is, we'll say. Not totally poetic, but that's what I've got here on the fly. Let's say the danger is a trio of witches who are obligated by some sort of ancient contract with the demon to protect the weapon, to make sure the weapon never gets in anyone's hands. So the witches are danger in that cave. The grim portents, in that case, these are things that are happening as the player characters are exploring that cave system. These are things that typically are, in the way I usually use them, they're counting down to an encounter with the witches, right? They are things that the witches are doing to help. Well, they're things that the witches are doing that kind of show their presence, or at least allow the GM to show their presence. They are possibly like small encounters. Like it could be one of the grim portents is the witch sends its, it's like wicked familiar after you or whatever, right? And so you have to fight the familiar. It could be, the very first grim portent when they first enter the cave could be some kind of evidence of a ritual that the witch is engaged in, right? And that would be a GM move as well, right? Like announcing future badness or whatever, right? So essentially what you'd be doing is your player characters would be moving through the cave system, maybe fighting monsters, maybe fighting treasures. Occasionally, you might look at your grim portents and have something from the grim portents happen, right? Grim portents are a fantastic reaction when you're called upon to make a move, right? Depending on the circumstances of what's going on. So essentially, the grim portents kind of like are counting down, pacing us toward this encounter with the witches. Now, maybe the party finds the witches before the witches are able to do whatever they're going to do. Maybe the impending doom, getting on to impending doom now, maybe the impending doom is the witches are indeed casting a ritual. Okay. Maybe that's it's all kind of leading toward. And if the player characters don't find the witches in time, then, the ritual goes off and it does whatever terrible thing it's going to do. That leads to stakes questions to some degree, right? One of your stakes questions might be, what happens if the three witches are able to complete their ritual? How do the player characters react to that?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree, but I really think like the grim portents are like, what happens if it goes completely unchecked? It's not just like you're getting closer, so there's more evidence.
That's true too. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. I think like when you look at it from like the campaign level, at the campaign level, I'm much more inclined to use them the way you're suggesting there, David, which is, let's say at the campaign level, our danger is the big demon, right? These grim portents that are likely happening out of the things that are happening out of the purview of the immediate purview of the characters. Those are like, to me, if we leave this alone, what happens? Like if we don't follow up, trying to help the kingdom with this problem, or if we don't react to the knowledge that we have that there is this ancient evil demon, what happens? That is a definite, like, to me, like that's a big effective use of campaign front danger grim portents, right? Your grim portents might be the demon convinces the king to cast out the religious order from the kingdom, right? The demon convinces the king to give up his daughter to be a sacrifice to the demon's worshippers or whatever, right? That's stuff that has no direct bearing on the player characters necessarily, but it is like big world stuff that is happening because the players are not reacting to it, are not investigating it, are not fighting back against it, right? I think in the adventure front context, which is a little bit more immediate and a little bit more like stakes are lower, I think it's okay to use it just more as like a clock, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of distinguishing the two, because like the players are trying to engage with the adventure front. So they aren't they aren't ignoring it.
Yeah, if they're there, they're not ignoring it, right?
Right, but if they're getting hung up on, like, I don't know, trying to do some other side thing that they've found in this cave structure that you've given up, then, like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense that, yep, the witches are getting further along in their whole ritual thing that they're going to do, and what are they trying to do? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's right. So much of it depends on the circumstances, right? The circumstances, the scope of what's going on, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of variables. Any case, yeah, it is ultimately the grim portents are leading to the impending doom. The impending doom is the bad thing that is going to happen, right? I usually have that mean that in the adventure front context, at least, it means that the bad thing, the danger comes to pass. Maybe the danger like strikes at the player characters. Maybe the danger, maybe the player characters are trying to rescue someone, right? And the impending doom is, well, sorry, you're too late. They've murdered or eaten or whatever the person you were trying to rescue or something like that, right? It just kind of depends on the circumstances. What about stakes questions? What's your view on stakes questions? Because I'll say that I don't actively use them, even though I know that I know that like, just because of the way I think about my prep and the way I do things, I don't really like actively think about things in terms of stakes questions, at least not anymore. But I used to. What's your thinking on stakes questions?
Well, so from the book, what are stakes? Stakes are 1 to 3 questions about people, places, or groups that you're interested in. Stakes are a way of reminding yourself of what you want to find out. In that sense of, what are we doing in Dungeon World? We're playing to find out what happens. These are the things you're trying to find out. Now, I don't necessarily like write these when I'm writing Grim Portents or Impending Dooms, because I think I have a good idea, like, what those are about. I like know that I want to find out what happens if the Impending Doom doesn't happen, but I don't need to write that down. Like, I know that. I'm usually more interested in the stakes of like my player characters, like interpersonal relationships and like their emotions. I don't know. That's what I'm really curious about. And those are stakes to me, I guess. Like, do they come out of this unscathed is kind of more of what I'm interested in. So it's indirectly tied to the Grim Portents and Impending Doom, but it's not exactly the way the book has it written. So don't feel like you have to do it exactly the way the book has it written. I guess we've said that enough, but
I think the way I look at stakes questions is, you're right. Like there are like obvious outcomes if the various dangers get their way, right? A question doesn't usually need to be posed about that, right? To me, I'm essentially agreeing with you. I think the stakes questions are more about player character reactions, their emotions, their beliefs, their ideology. Those are the kinds of things I'm interested in knowing. Going back to my very quickly formulated and sprawling example of the demon who's controlling the kingdom. Let's say there's like a religious order that's in opposition to the demon, and one of the Grim Portents is that the demon is able to convince the king to oust that religious order so that religious order is no longer a threat. And let's say that religious order, for whatever reason, we know that religious order is also has bad blood with one of the player characters, either as an individual or whatever, right? Like maybe this religious order, maybe one of the player characters has had a bad experience with them. Maybe they're an ex-member of the order and they want revenge on them or something like that. A stakes question might be, how will that player character react when they learn the demon has cast them out, or when they learn that religious order is exiled or something like that, right? Because then it kind of, it poses an interesting problem, right? It's like, yes, that religious order, they suck. I hate them for whatever reason as a player character, right? And I like to see them brought low. But on the flip side, they're one of the only people standing against the demon, right? And I think that's an interesting stakes question, right? Because it involves the character's beliefs, it involves their emotions, it involves their motivations. And so that's kind of like the space that I think stakes questions operate in.
Yeah, and I agree, which is why it's problematic to write them in advance, because Grim Portents must have been satisfied before that could possibly be a question. So they might be an evolving thing.
Yeah, well, so that's actually a pretty decent segue, I think, which is, when do we make fronts, right? I think that's important to talk about.
So first I'll give you the book's answer, and then I'll give you my answer. From the book, you'll make your campaign front and first adventure fronts after your first session. Your campaign front may not be complete when you first make it. You'll also make adventure fronts. 1 or 2 is usually a good number. If you find yourself with more, consider leaving some possible fronts as just notes for now. I agree that if you're trying to do more than 2 adventure fronts in a campaign, you might get bogged down. That's pretty ambitious. I don't necessarily agree with, like, you have to play a whole session before you can start making fronts. Maybe that's a play culture thing where you and I both play on pretty tight schedules, so we kind of have to get right into the action. But I don't know. What do you think?
I basically agree with the book. I mean, the way I organize my sessions, and bearing in mind, this is a bit of a like gauntlet specific thing here, listeners, but the way I organize my sessions, which is usually in series of 4 or 5 sessions, right? I usually have the first session. I have like a really like kind of tight procedure that I follow for the first session. And that tight procedure doesn't really have anything to do with the main adventure. It mostly just is seeing the characters be together, watching them travel to wherever the adventure is, getting to see the characters interact with each other as a group of people, adventuring together as a party, kind of learning about them, kind of learning what they can do. And in that sense, it's not super important that I have the adventure front ready to go, or my version of the adventure front, right? Like, it's not super important for it to be ready by session 1. And indeed, I usually pose questions to the players, which I call establishing questions, but I pose questions to the players that help me inform my front creation, right? And even though I don't really do fronts, I'm going to just say front creation for ease of explanation here. It's the translation is what I do, what I consider to be my own personal fronts. But in any case, I kind of see that. Like, to me, I think that the first session of Dungeon World, as written anyway, wants to be about the real open conversation at the table, talking about what are we interested in seeing? Let's talk about bonds. Let's talk about backstory. Let's talk about all the different little organizations and things in the world. Let's kind of create the world together, right? And, if you play Dungeon World as written, which kind of assumes you are playing for many, many sessions with the same group of people, you kind of do it that way, right? Like, you spend that first session just sort of kind of creating a rough sketch of the world and kind of figuring out where the players fit into it. And then in between the first session and second session, the GM can kind of like look at those notes and say, okay, this is really grabby. Like, the players seem to be really interested in the Thieves Guild that is after this one character. So I'm going to make the Thieves Guild. At the very least, they're probably a danger. Maybe there's a front associated with it. Hey, I know. Maybe the first adventure is going to be like infiltrating the Thieves Guild hideout to steal something, right? And so you might maybe create a couple of Thieves Guild related dangers, drop them in there, have that be your front. And then maybe you also have some notes about a secret religious order that one of the player characters has a bad history with and hates. Maybe it's a little unclear where they fit in yet, but you at least have some notes, and maybe in future sessions you think about turning them into a danger, or adding them to a front or something. And so I basically agree with the book. You're correct. The way we organize sessions in the Gauntlet, we have to kind of get to the point a little quicker. But I think it's still in the same spirit of it, though.
Yeah, I agree. Like, this is a good way of doing it if you have the time in a consistent group. But if you're running on a tight schedule, it can be a bit tough. Yeah,
if you're doing let's say you're doing a one shot, like a con game.
Yeah.
If you're doing a con game,
you probably need an adventure front at least.
I think you do the adventure front right away, right? You might pose a couple questions to the players just to kind of give them a chance to kind of personalize the adventure a little bit. But for the most part, you have a couple dangers. You've got them in a dungeon. You have a couple dangers. You've got maybe 4 of the rooms filled in. Maybe 3 of them are blank, and you go, right?
Right. Yeah. So I've got a one shot that I run for new players. And for that, I have the adventure front pretty defined. I have a single danger, and then I ask questions throughout that inevitably flesh out a second danger that I then will drop in like halfway through the session, like at the halfway point.
I love it. Cool. Well, I mean, is there anything else you want to say here? I mean, at the end of the day, this is just notes, listeners.
It really is. It really is just notes. I will point out for players that really want to, and GMs who really want to like try and hit this as written or as close to as written as possible, page 185 does a good job of explaining creating fronts and how many of each thing you should have in each category. They say, if you're choosing a front, if it's an adventure front or a campaign front, choose 2 to 3 dangers. Choose an impending doom for each danger. Add grim portents, 1 to 3 for an adventure front, 3 to 5 for campaign front. Write 1 to 3 stakes questions, and then list like the general cast of characters and for the front.
Awesome. I'll also throw in there really quickly a little plug for my other show, Fear of the Black Dragon. Tom and I, my co-host on that show, Tom and I, we frequently talk about ways of using Dungeon World prep techniques and GM techniques as a way of more effectively running more trad or OSR type games. And I think that's actually really good listening, because we actually talk about, like, in one episode, I think it's the second episode, The Skyblind Spire, we talk about like grim portents as a way of creating an ecology in the dungeon, right? Like how you can use grim portents to sort of make the dungeon feel like a living, breathing space. And so that's kind of an interesting take on the sort of like grim portents idea. In other episodes, we talk about ways you can use front techniques to adapt modules from OSR games and from old school games. And so if you just want like a little bit of a deeper dive on these concepts, some of those episodes of Fear of Black Dragon are a great tool. Well, I think that's a pretty good quick breakdown of Fronts. Shall we move on?
Yeah.
Let's go to the AP. Hi, listeners. I wanted to let you know that the newest issue of Codex, Joy 2, is now available in the Gauntlet's $4 Patreon feed. It's a sequel to the original Codex Joy, and it's terrific. Here is what you'll find inside. Storm Riders, a rules-light game inspired by the action-packed fantasy cartoons of the 1980s, such as Masters of the Universe and Thundercats. A Feast of Jovial Moments, a collection of evocative images for Swords Without Master and other swords and sorcery games. Grandma's Drinking Song, a hilarious songwriting LARP that tells the story of a family of Jewish bootleggers in 1930s New York City. True Beauty, a framework that recontextualizes the game Monster Hearts 2 to be about young queer people of color in the ballroom scene of 1980s Harlem. Our miscellany, 36 local holidays and celebrations, 5 original illustrations, and a gorgeous custom layout by Jake Householder. You can get Codex Joy 2 by making a $4 or higher pledge on the Gauntlet Patreon by November 30th. As a bonus, you will also receive the original Codex Joy. And a quick reminder that back issues of Codex can be found on Drive-Thru RPG. Thanks. All right, listeners, we are back. We are telling the story of Lucero Castafiel. And when we last saw Lucero, he had just rescued, almost, his sister Urbina by cutting her away from this sort of life-draining network thing that she was attached to, running through this crypt with swarms of undead at his heels. He got to the ladder. He's getting ready to climb the ladder. He's beginning climbing the ladder. And the hundreds and hundreds of undead are swarming, amassing at the base of the ladder and kind of like making their way up. Like if you've ever seen World War Z and the zombies sort of like piling up against the wall, it's a similar idea. They're piling up on top of each other to try to reach Lucero and Urbina. Possibly just Urbina. They may not give a shit about you. I think this is, obviously it seems pretty obvious what you're going to do here. I would say, what do you do? But I think it's pretty straightforward. You're probably trying to climb as fast as possible to get out of there, correct?
Well, it's a shaft, right?
It does have handholds, though, right? I think it's a shaft, but you're able to climb it.
Yeah, you can climb it, but I'm saying it bottlenecks, right?
It does bottleneck. Yeah, that's true.
Okay. Yeah, obviously I'm trying to get away, but if I can get a good enough lead on him, I might try and like set something here where it'll make him even slower to try and get through.
Oh, I like that. Okay, that's good. I think the problem one is going to be just, can you like climb quickly enough to get at least some breathing room from them, right? Major difficulty is going to be the fact that you have Urbina over your shoulder, which means this is a tough climb. And climbing in Dungeon World, a weird wrinkle of Dungeon World is it's always con. So I think a Defy Danger con is appropriate in this situation. How does that sound?
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Okay. I've got an 8.
You're making decent pace. You are definitely going to get away from the horde below, or at least you're going to get enough space away from them, right? But you're not getting to the top as quickly as you need to. You're momentarily safe from the horde, but you have to take like regular breathers, right? Because this is exhausting what you're doing. And you first you feel some drip, 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 like on your helmet, on your nose. You look up and a little bit gets into your mouth, and you hear a kind of snarling and hissing, and you'll see in the ambient light coming from topside and down below, you'll be able to make out another one of these long-limbed, leathery, ghoul-like creatures climbing down, but like climbing head down, right? like kind of like
face first down.
Face first down, yeah. And it's got this like its bile is dripping out of its mouth, right, as it does so. It's climbing towards you down the ladder. What do you do?
Oh, jeez. Well, is it naked or does it have like clothes on or what?
It's naked, yeah.
Okay.
Just white rubbery skin.
Yeah. I think I'll just, as it like reaches down, I'll just try and reach up and let gravity do the work for me and try and pull it down past me.
Oh, nice. Good. Give me a defy danger with strength.
Okay. Fuck. 5.
You reach for the creature and you reach up to grab it, but its arm is longer than you expect, and it actually reaches to grab you and indeed gets a good hold of you, right? And it's unclear who's holding who here. You are doing your best to wrench it free. There's a bit of a back and forth going on between the two of you. You're rocking back and forth in this narrow shaft with these narrow handholds. And Urbina, she just mutters, just let me go. And whether it's an accident is unclear, but she slides off your shoulder and falls down into the swarm of the crypt. And we just see her disappear, or at least land in the swarm, and the swarm just overtakes her. Well, listeners, that's our show. We hope you enjoyed it. Discern Realities is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find us in several places. We're on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. We're on G+, in the community section of G+. Just search for The Gauntlet. We have a website, gauntlet-rpg.com, and we are on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. David, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks so much to our editor, Paul. And listeners, thank you. My name is David. My name is not David. Try that again.